Welcome to the Legal Drugs Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Stoyanovich. Together, we will discuss the long and complex process behind what it takes to get a drug to market, a journey that affects both our day-to-day lives and most critical moments. Legal Drugs Podcast is a production of Legal Drugs Agency.
Hi, this is Vivian Juder-Frankel. I'm the producer of the upcoming livestream salon Compounding Pharmacies, Achieving Quality Through Process and Procedure on August 18, 19, and 20th. Lee is one of the speakers at our event and will be leading a panel discussion on the industry response to COVID-19. He will also be facilitating a roundtable on how to address concerns raised by the FDA with a limited budget. If you would like to discuss any of these topics with Lee, please join the salon by going to www.pharmasalon.com/compounding.
Welcome to the 25th episode of the Legal Drugs Podcast. I cannot wait to introduce this next guest to you. This is kind of a new angle we're taking in looking at more of the legal aspects and really the manufacturing process of the legal drugs business, which is something we have yet to really explore together. So I'm really excited about this discussion on compounding pharmacy labs and our ability globally even to manufacture pharmaceuticals for patients and producing and distributing drugs the legal way. So Lee Rosebush is my guest this episode, and he's kind of talking about how the pandemic has affected the legal drugs manufacturing business, as well as in general, how we've been doing things, how we've been manufacturing drugs at different standards, both in the U.S. and offshore. And you'll hear us talk a little bit about that. But I think Lee's background is just so diverse. As an attorney, he is the team leader of the pharmacy and reimbursement program, as well as the co-leader of the FDA practice at his firm, where with his unique background in defense, regulatory, and as a registered patent attorney, has also worked as a pharmacist, bringing forth really a depth of firsthand experience to his clients as a counsel or as a legal counsel. So he really possesses this unique understanding of the pharmaceutical industry. And I think really in this discussion was just able to break down so much in layman's terms for us to understand what's going on in navigating the legal, government, and pharmaceutical environment. Well, I hope you enjoy this. As always, do not hesitate to give us your feedback, leave a review, rate this podcast, and of course, hit us up on social media on Instagram at Legal Drugs Podcast. Okay, I look forward to hearing from you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Legal Drugs Podcast. I'm really excited to host a new guest on the show, Lee. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience. I have been hinting, by the way, in some episodes leading up to this one, over the fact that we were going to go there in terms of discussing and dissecting the issue of drug manufacturing, which I think you're going to be able to help us do today. So I'm really excited about this topic.
Perfect. Happy to.
Yeah. So tell us your full name. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up? Where are you from? Whatever you want to kind of share about you personally before we get more into the real business.
Sure. So for those who have met me before, my name is Lee Rosebush. I actually have a whole lot of degrees. It's a PharmD, Doctor of Pharmacy. I'm a registered pharmacist in a couple different states still. I'm a JD from Case Western. I actually have an MBA and a master's in finance, which means I went to school way too long. But in the pharmacy world, I've been in and around pharmacy now for over 20 years at this point. I've done everything from working and stocking shelves at pharmacies and being a pharmacy tech, all the way up to working as a pharmacist at the Cleveland Clinic, in some of the largest U.S. regulatory departments for drug manufacturers. I've spent some time at the FDA, and now I'm sort of on the dark side. I'm the consultant in legal world, moving things forward here. So,
wow, that's quite a diverse background. How did you make the jump into the legal, by the way?
Sure. It sounds cheesy, and everybody always laughs at me and says, "Are you really being truthful?" But to be honest with you, I was a pharmacist. I had one of the greatest professors, in my opinion, to ever be in the pharmacy world. His name is Tom Wilson. He was a pharmacist and attorney at Purdue University, and anybody who's gone through Purdue or Butler and has taken the pharmacy law classes to get their license knows the name. And he grabbed me aside one day and he said, "Lee, are you happy with what you're doing?" And I said, "Well, Honestly, I feel like I can make a difference in one person's life as a pharmacist, but I feel like there's a greater good out there that I could do more. And he said, why don't you try the legal world? And I started going down it. I had the funny feeling I was going to be a patent attorney for a drug manufacturer. To this day, I have my patent attorney license. I'm registered with the USPTO. I've prosecuted maybe half of a patent. Decided off right away that wasn't for me. And went to work for the FDA and have been doing FDA and pharmacy law stuff ever since.
Wow, I that is incredible. I have so many questions and I don't even know where to start. So starting off with basically jumping into this legal piece, right? I just have a quick funny story about the Legal Drugs Podcast show. When I was first starting, people thought I was an attorney because I used the word legal, right? But obviously, it's obviously just a cheeky way to get people's attention about pharmaceuticals. And you and I had a discovery call prior to our recording today where we were kind of talking about a lot of the mainstream opinions of things. And there was a book just published, right? And I don't want to go into all the details or even and mention titles or author or anything like that, but just that this new idea has been introduced to the public over the fact that there are some concerns with manufacturing. So before we get to kind of that issue, unpack a little bit more for us what your job entails. What are you doing day in and day out? Who you represent? You mentioned the FDA. I think a lot of people feel that the FDA is mysterious. Can you break down some of that in some bite sizes for us to digest?
It's interesting you say that because I probably spend about half my time dealing with the FDA and about half my time with pharmacy world. And a lot of people say, what do you really do? And I often say, well, I'm sort of the translator, right? Between the legal world, the agency, and those in the pharmacy or the drug manufacturer and what they're doing. So I actually represent a whole broad spectrum of folks. A lot of times when people deal with the FDA, they'll say, look, I'm either a drug attorney or I'm a food attorney or I'm a device attorney. And the nice thing about my practice and the unique background that I have of working with the manufacturers and pharmacy, being at the FDA, is we actually represent a whole broad spectrum of everybody. So I've done everything from working with folks who are doing food processing, which is a little bit different than what we're talking today. I've filed 510Ks. I have personally signed off on orphan drug applications that have to do with like leukemia and lymphoma. So I've actually reviewed some of those applications and signed off. We help with drug advertising. So when you see those 90-second commercials, you can yell at me for doing things like that. And we actually help with a lot of drug applications as well. And then my favorite thing as being a pharmacist is we work with the pharmacy compounders and outsourcing facilities, which right now, and the unique time period that we're in, I'm using unique, not necessarily as a good or a bad term, because it's just so different, right? With the pandemic going on, with this unique time period that they've really started from an agency and an industry side to see the importance of those in the compounding world.
Mm-hmm. So let's go into that then. What has changed in the pandemic time? How were things pre-pandemic, current pandemic, and maybe even what are your insights as to how this industry will be affected post-pandemic?
Sure. So it's interesting. I think the pandemic has woken, is for the best way to say that, right, in air quotes, a lot of people. Because prior to the pandemic, there's a few pieces that are out there. They'll talk about the percentage of drugs, for example, that are made overseas. And I understand that. I wear the MBA and a master's of financing. I understand from a dollars and cents side why certain things are made where they're at. But now with the national security issue and with the health and safety issue, it's become less of an economic side and more of a concern with patient safety and security that we're starting to see the need to bring drugs and manufacturing back here in the United States. And the FDA and those in the administration and even those in the industry are starting to acknowledge that currently most of the drug manufacturing, because it's done overseas, there isn't really a good manufacturing base of knowledge nor facilities here in the United States. The one area that is still there is those in the outsourcing facility. I mean, people kind of look down on the compounders and outsourcing facility if you were in pharma, right? They were the stepchild, right, from that perspective. And the interesting thing is now most of them have pointed to them and said, look, they understand from a quality and CGMP process because the FDA has been inspecting them for the last couple of years. Could we use that and leverage that to bring some of that manufacturing back here? And we're starting to see that. A perfect example is BARDA just this week offering up close to, when you combine the two contracts, over $800 million to a company by the name of Flow, which is down in Richmond, Virginia, to bring some of that API manufacturing back. And I think you're going to start to see some more of it, because prior to now, a lot of times people said it was conspiracy theory, but there were issues with manufacturing overseas and organized crime, putting things into drugs, and confiscating issues with countries. And people have said those are all national security issues. We need to take care of that manufacture of drugs here.
Wow. So it sounds like there will be more of a mix of bringing some manufacturing back, even in post-pandemic era.
I think so, right? As somebody who's a realist who wears both hats, so deals with the PEs in the industry, both sides, and also with those in pharma, I would say I don't think you're ever going to have 100% manufacturing back here. But I think what you'll see is a large swath, and I'm just going to use a number as an example, 50-50 happen. And I wouldn't be surprised if you don't see quality agreements going forward from like hospitals and purchasing agents say, hey, we want so much of our product made here in the United States. And I could also see the federal government saying, look, if you, just like they do in copyrights, right? If you get a book and a copyright, you have to donate a version of it to the Library of Congress. So we have a version. I would be shocked if we don't see up on the Hill come together and say, look, if you want to have an approval here, you have to give so much of our drug to the national stockpile. So we have some here in the United States. And I also would see likely that we have different pricing schedules. So those in like the Department of Defense, when they buy drugs for the VA and TRICARE and get into like 340B and DISH hospitals, if they say, look, we're going to pay so much for those drugs made in the United States, they'll pay so much for those drugs manufactured overseas. And so you have differencing from that perspective. So I think there'll be incentives like that, but I don't think you'll get 100%, but I do think you're going to start to see a large percentage start to be made here in the United States again.
That's interesting. So one of the things that you said in that was CGMP. And I wondered if you could break down to the listener who is that layperson, the person who's a non-expert in this world, what are some of those terms? What are some of those acronyms that we throw out there, particularly in the manufacturing portion of the legal drugs business? For example, GMP, right? And then also just tell us a little bit more about regulation. You know, what kinds of things are regulated, and maybe even what issues have you noticed? I know you mentioned a story to me prior to our recording again that was kind of interesting about some of the things that we're starting to notice in terms of discrepancies overseas, and you've already kind of touched on that, but just give us a better visual of what those labs look like. And I say labs air quote as well, because you know some people define a lab in one way versus another, but really these facilities where drugs are being pieced together, if you will. What does regulation look like? And you know, break down some of the terminology for us, if you don't mind.
Sure. So it's funny because especially for those that are new to the area, a lot of people like to call me the king of acronyms because everything is
we all use, we're all terrible at acronyms in every industry. Yeah,
exactly. So for those who haven't heard, CGMP is what they call current good manufacturing practices. Think of it as the standard that is used to make drugs. And what the FDA has in essence said is look, if you make a drug, whether you're Eli Lilly, Pfizer, et cetera, on the brand side, or your Teva, your Mylan, et cetera, on the generic side, or for those in the outsourcing world, if you're, you know, the Cuvas, the SCAs, right, you start going down that list, the Fagrans, they all have to follow what they call the CGMP, or the current good manufacturing practices. The difference is for those in the compounding world who are not 503Bs, that's sort of the cutoff. You don't have to make it at CGMP. And so that's sort of one of the talking points you'll get is, well, those in the outsourcing world have to make it a CGMP, right? Just like pharma does, where those in the 503A don't. And the reason why that's important is you want a standard when you make a drug. You want to be able to say that at least hit the minimum floor, because that's what a CGMP is. It's not best a standard. It's a minimum floor that has to be used to make the product. And the interesting thing is, I wish I could say, as a former FDAer and somebody who has 5 kids, right, who has to put those drugs into my kids, is that all drug manufacturers meet that same CGMP standard, and they don't. One of the things that has happened, interestingly, especially in the international world, is that there are certain standards that aren't being met on the CGMP side. If you just simply Google it, you'll see in the Indian companies, for example, Ranbaxy and a few of the others who had data integrity issues. You'll see discussions around from the Chinese side, right, as to when individuals have to go there to inspect. The FDA has to get a visa, for example, and they have to apply and let the Chinese companies know that they're coming because they have to schedule out in advance. And so it's not to the same type of standard that you would see here, where it's an unannounced, uninspected, where it's a true inspection when somebody comes in to see if it's at the right standard. So even though a lot of companies will say that they abide by the CGMP, not everybody's abiding by that same level of standard across the board. And what's scary to me, especially as somebody who deals in this industry and a former FDAer, is that the FDA knows that, right? I wrote an article, I'll do a little self-plug. I wrote an article that was published in Newsweek last week on this exact issue. And I pulled out some of Dr. Janet Woodcock's testimony when she went up to the Hill and testified in October 2019. And she even in that testimony admitted, yes, they know of CGMP issues from international companies, and sometimes they do not take action because they're afraid of drug shortages and what would happen if they did that. Now,
gosh.
Right? And it's a direct testimony. It's in 10:15 in the morning from October 30th, 31st testimony in 2019. And look, I understand that as a policy person, we don't want drug shortages, and so we don't want those types of things that are happening. But at the same time, could you imagine if, especially after NECC, if you had an outsourcing facility or a compounder that had CGMP issues and the FDA knew they had CGMP issues and publicly said they weren't going to take action, right? And so those are the types of discrepancies that I think really need to be addressed. And that's why when it comes back to the national security issues, right, especially in a COVID type situation, and we're starting to see this with things like masks, you're starting to see it with the vaccine development. You saw it with hydroxychloroquine, with some of the pills that were donated from the Indian companies, is that if you're going to be taking that, you want to at least know that it's safe. That's the idea behind it, that it was FDA approved, it was safe. But can we really count on that now with everything that's going on? And I think that's where you're starting to see some of the encouragement of bringing some of this back in the national security side, in addition to saying, hey, somebody could hold this up in a trade leverage issue, et cetera.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wow. I'm so glad you brought that up. I wanted to ask you a question about that article. And that's exactly what I was hoping you would highlight, because my career has been so much on the early research, the drug discovery, the drug development, the animal testing to make sure that the drug works, that it's effective, right? And that it's safe in animals before clinical trials. And I don't know much about clinical trials, and I definitely don't know that much about manufacturing. And so this is so interesting for me as a consumer who's kind of said to myself, look, unless I know that my headache is coming from some other source than just the fact that I haven't had enough water today, I'm going to go get a glass of water instead of popping aspirin, right? Just because I don't know that much about the final, what's in this pill, right? Before I just simply pop it. And that's so scary to me sometimes, not knowing. How do consumers become more engaged, right? I mean, part of the mission of this podcast is just to kind of pull the curtain back on this incredibly mysterious and complex industry, right? At every level. But how does how does one begin to learn more about this process, particularly on the final product, these final drugs, and have confidence in what we're doing? Where's a good place to start? Or how do you, again, have that confidence when you go to consume a medicine and you're not sure the source? So, are you able to track at this point whether your bottle of pills is from onshore or offshore manufacturer? Do you think that's going to be a thing, or is that a thing?
Right. As of right now, the interesting thing, and again, it goes back to Dr. Woodcock's own testimony. So it's not from this perspective of me saying, hey, this is conspiracy theory or something that's out there. The FDA themselves will say they do not know right now where your API is coming from. The reason being is when you make a pill, pick a drug, right? Any statin, any antibiotic, the manufacturer is known by the FDA because they have to know who's distributing it, how the adverse events come, who's registered with that drug. And one of the requirements is that you say who the manufacturer of that pill is, because not every drug is made by the person who's actually selling it. They have what they call contract manufacturers. The problem is when you take a step back, where did that contract manufacturer get their supplies? That's not always registered. And so a lot of times you'll hear the term thrown around API or active ingredient. That's like when you take a Tylenol, that's the actual Tylenol that's in a pill. There's a lot of other stuff that's in it. Or, any other type of the statins or antibiotics we're talking about. It's the actual name of the drug that's in it. a lot of times who's making that and selling it, the FDA doesn't know where that is coming from. And that's scary to a lot of people because there isn't the ability to say, hey, that Tylenol that you're taking inside of that pill came from name your other country.
Right.
Right. And it goes back to some of the safety issues. That is one of the things that we have actually asked the FDA and asked the Hill is going forward, especially now that you're going to be bringing back some of this, is why don't you require, right, where did the API come from?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be a resource issue. That should be something. We have pedigree documents in pharmacy world. We have documents that track back a lot of the stuff that we can get all the way back to the farm from this. Why should we do the same thing with drugs? And so we're hoping going forward from a safety side that is done. Now, the other area, and you're starting to see a lot of labs, you brought up labs in a second, start to get into this business model. And for the record, I don't represent the company I'm about to mention, and I don't own any stock in them. This is just me pointing out a company. I want to be clear with that.
Okay.
But there's companies like ValueSure, right, or labs from this side of it that will actually, if you get a bottle of 100 pills or 30 pills, you could send them one. And they'll actually do a study on it and actually break the pill down. They run it through machines like an HPLC or UPLC type machine. And they'll say, what is actually inside that pill? And it's funny because for years, we've heard about drugs like metformin and how safe it was, or statins and how great they are inside of the body. And then somebody sent some off to ValueSure and some of these other labs, and they found things like NDMA inside of the tablets. And they're like, wait a minute, have people been taking those carcinogens for 20 years now that we didn't know about? And the question I would have, and a lot of times you'll get this from the FDA, is well, that amount of NDMA that's inside that pill isn't enough to cause an issue. Okay, well, what if I've been taking that pill for 10 years? Has it now built up in my system over the last 10 years where now I have potential for carcinogen? Notice you never hear things like that addressed. And right. I think that becomes the concern going forward is, do we need to have that type of lab in place, right? Or should we be able to trust the FDA and these drug manufacturers that they don't have this type of material in? I think it needs to be a combination of both. And the same goes for those. A lot of people will say, hey, we need to import our drugs because it's cheaper, right? It's sort of against them. I would say that's even more dangerous if you don't have these labs in place. If you have the labs in place, now you could import these drugs, run the same type of study and say, hey, we know the drugs you're importing are okay because they're going through this. So I think you're going to start to see a buildup of more of these types of labs where they can take a statistical significant number, whatever that number would be, 1, 2, 5, 10, right? Depending on how many pills you have, run the test and tell you, yeah, you are taking, it is safe what you're taking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be true transparency and drop the double standard, right? And really open people's eyes to what's really going on here and hold our regulators accountable, right? So that their communication back to consumers is clean and crisp and really trustworthy. So you bring up so many great points. I love it. This is so informative.
Well, and the other things I would say is look, on that same note, the outsourcing facilities and the compounders that we've talked about at the beginning, right? Because I know that was the initial idea, was to talk about them. They have to do a similar type of study. They have to do potency studies and stability studies, et cetera, when they release drugs. And so I'm not saying they're safer then. Please don't take it as that way, or for your listeners. But if we're requiring that type of studies and results tests for them, why aren't we requiring it across the board for the entire pharma industry? They should be. And they should have these types of labs available for each of the pills that are being distributed going forward. And that, to me, is one of the, going back to why the importance of what's been changed in this pandemic, one of the big things that's been going on. Because, again, you can point to that outsourcing industry and say, okay, they have to report everything every 6 months. They have to do those types of studies. And that's where the administration, right or wrong, it's where the administration and the FDA has sort of pointed to say, we're requiring these guys to do it. Why aren't we requiring the reporting of API across the board? We're requiring these guys to test. Why aren't we requiring that reporting and testing across the board?
Right.
That's what I start to, the nice thing about it is I'm not the pharma guy, I'm not the drug guy. We're trying to combine different things when we work with the American Society of Pharmacy Law boards, the APHA boards, et cetera, with the administration.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, thank you for that work. It's important. It's invaluable, I think, to the greater good of society. So thanks for shedding some light on this. In wrapping up, first of all, I can already tell that we need to have you on the show again because there's so much to unpack here. So I'm
Happy to.
spinning in so many directions, but this is so good. What would you like to leave us with? And maybe a call to action, your contact information, a personal story, anything to just leave us with as we're all kind of coping with this current pandemic.
I would say stay engaged. The biggest thing that can be done right now is to continue to push those at the associations, whether it's one of the ones that I run, the Outsourcing Facility Association, whether it's a pharmacy association, whether it's pharma, et cetera, going down the list, and those up on the Hill about the need for this. I mean, the COVID situation showed that we do not have enough manufacturing of our pharma here in the United States, and that we're in dire and desperate need for these types of drugs here in the drug shortage world. The 503Bs, the outsourcing facilities, whatever you'd like to call us, have been able to step up and meet a lot of those needs from a drug shortage side. Some of the manufacturers, don't get me wrong, have also donated some drugs and been able to meet some of the needs associated with that, but it's not enough. We're still needing a lot more going forward. And so I would say, please continue to push. If those individuals are interested in getting a hold of us or our association, I'll share our website. It's www.503bs.org. That's 503bs.org. We have a list up there of all the drug shortages that are going on, things like propofol and succinylcholine and those types of drugs that are used for the vents, because you heard a lot of the need for vent, but you didn't hear about the need for the drugs that are used for the vents that are on shortage now.
Right.
We've tried to put up a list of those who are making those and where hospitals and physicians can find those drugs. We're doing it for free. There's no cost to us. There's no money to us, etc. And so those types of resources are available. And if people are looking for it, I'm happy to point to that and say, if you got any questions, reach out to us directly at any time.
That's fantastic. Thanks. And we'll put that website in the show notes as well.
Perfect.
So great, Lee. Thank you so much for coming on today. And I really do mean it when I say it would be great to have you again and to continue to unpack these kind of, late stage issues around the legal drugs business. So thanks so much for what you shared today.
No problem. Have a great one.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hi. Once again, this is Vivian. Angela, Lee, what a great episode. I want to once again inform everyone that they can talk to Lee about this and other topics at our upcoming live stream salon, Compounding Pharmacies, Achieving Quality Through Process and Procedures, on August 18th, 19th, and 20th. To get more information or to register, go to www.pharmasalon.com/compounding.
This episode is sponsored in part by Pharma Salon. Pharma Salon is disrupting the B2B event industry by organizing intellectual salons that enable learning by uniting hundreds of years of executive experience to solve the most challenging problems in life sciences. To learn more, go to pharmasalon.com. That's PHARMASALON.com. Legal Drugs Podcast is also sponsored by listeners like you on patreon.com. To become a patron of our podcast, please go to patreon.com/legaldrugspodcast. That's patreon.com/Legal Drugs Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Legal Drugs Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode today, please leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. It helps us share our story with others. Stay up to date by following us on Instagram at Legal Drugs Podcast or on LinkedIn at Legal Drugs Agency. I'm your host, Angela Stoyanovich, and I'll talk to you next time.